Welcome back. Before we begin, please dim your lights, turn on a gentle fan, and let your mind drift away from the noisy 21st century world tonight. Tonight, we speak of a forgotten era in history. We journey back to the 19th century, where a specific group of women found themselves suddenly labelled surplus. Imagine the year 1851. The British Empire was at its peak, yet a strange social panic began to brew within the census reports of the nation. Officials realised there were 500,000 more women than men. This demographic gap birthed the term surplus women, a cruel label for those without a husband. Were they truly extra, or did society simply lack a place for them outside the traditional kitchen and nursery? We explore the hidden lives of these pioneers. Look at these faces. These women were not mere statistics. They were daughters, sisters, and thinkers who faced a world that viewed their singlehood as a failure. Their eyes tell stories of a life lived in the shadows of expectation. They were the spinsters, the aunts, and the forgotten workers of the Victorian era. London in 1851 was a city of immense contrast. While the Great Exhibition celebrated progress, these women were trapped in a rigid, unchanging social hierarchy. Marriage was the only respected destination for a woman. To remain unmarried was to be a surplus, an unwanted commodity in a market driven by patriarchal norms. Society did not know where to put them. They were expected to be invisible, to serve their families without complaint, and to exist without any personal ambition. But behind the closed doors of their parlours and attics, these surplus women were beginning to question the very foundations of the society that had rejected them. The city hummed with the energy of the Industrial Revolution, yet the lives of these women remained static, bound by the invisible chains of Victorian ladylike decorum. Knitting, sewing, and waiting. For many this was the sum of their days. They were the silent background of every family gathering, the unmarried aunt who helped. This surplus was not a choice. It was the result of a mathematical cruelty that left thousands of women without the possibility of the marriage they were promised. We must ask ourselves, what happens to a person when their entire purpose is dictated by someone else? What happens when that purpose is suddenly taken away? Beneath the stiff collars and heavy skirts were individuals with dreams and an intellect. They were more than just a surplus. They were a hidden force of nature. The marriage market was a brutal competition. For every woman who found a husband, another was left behind, destined for a life of social and economic uncertainty. Every detail of their lives was scrutinized. Their clothing, their speech, and their silence were all markers of their status as the women who were not chosen. Rain fell on the streets of London just as it does today, but for these women it often felt like a shroud keeping them trapped inside their expectations. Many kept memories of men who had left for the colonies or the wars, never to return. The locket became a symbol of a life that wasn't. Walking alone was often seen as a sign of desperation or low status. The surplus woman had to navigate a world that wasn't built for the single. The newspapers were full of advice on how to handle the surplus. Some suggested emigration, others suggested more domestic training, but few suggested real lasting independence. Time moved differently for them. Without the milestones of marriage and children, the years could blend into a long, monotonous stretch of serving the needs of others. Stitch by stitch, they built the lives of others while their own remained unfinished. They were the invisible weavers of the social fabric, never receiving any credit. Together, they were a silent majority. In the drawing rooms of England, the surplus women were everywhere, yet they were spoken of as if they were ghosts. They were like pressed flowers, preserved in the pages of history, but stripped of their original vibrancy and life by the weight of the social norm surrounding. Their letters tell of their frustrations and their secret hopes. They wrote to each other, creating a network of support that the world outside could never see. The curtain was always drawn. Privacy was their only refuge, yet it was also their prison. They lived in a world of whispers and half-spoken truths today. Their work was often trivialized, dusting, arranging, and organizing. They were the keepers of the domestic peace, ensuring that everything looked perfect while their hearts were heavy. As the sun set on the first half of the century, The problem of the surplus women only grew. It was a math problem that society couldn't solve. Why was there such a lack of men? The answer lies in the grand, hungry ambition of the British Empire, which sent its sons to every corner. Men were the explorers, the soldiers, and the administrators. They boarded ships headed for distant lands, chasing fortune and glory while leaving the women behind at home. The call of the frontier was louder than the call of the hearth. For many young men, the prospect of a new life abroad was far more. They went to India, to the Americas, and to the rugged bush of Australia. Many died of tropical diseases, or in the countless skirmishes of imperial expansion. Fortune was the lure, but the price was paid in human lives. Every man who failed to return left a gap in the social fabric of his home. The docks of Liverpool and London were stages for thousands of goodbyes. These were the moments when the surplus was created, one departing ship at a time, a simple wave, a final look. These departures were often permanent. The men were building a new world while the women were left in the old one. Wars also took their toll. The Crimea claimed thousands of young lives, further skewing the gender balance and leaving a generation of women without partners for marriage. Each fallen soldier was a potential husband, a father, a provider. Their absence reverberated through the villages and towns of England, creating a silent, growing demographic void. The math was simple but devastating. For every 100 women, there were only 90 men available. In the upper classes, the disparity was even more pronounced. When the census data was compiled, the numbers told a story of imbalance. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a documented reality that society had changed. While men were conquering the globe, women were literally being constricted. The corset was a physical manifestation of the social restrictions that limited their every move and breath. This device was designed to make them fragile. A woman who couldn't breathe, couldn't work, couldn't travel, and certainly couldn't challenge the status quo of her life. She was a decorative object, a symbol of her family's wealth and status. But without a husband to belong to, her value was suddenly in question today. An unmarried woman was like a book without a title. She existed, but she had no place on the shelf of Victorian society's rigid and formal expectations. Men stepped into the unknown with purpose. They were encouraged to seek adventure, to be the architects of their own destiny, far away from the stifling parlour. Life in the colonies was harsh but full of opportunity for men. They could reinvent themselves, while the women at home were bound by their family's name. Diseases like malaria and cholera were the silent enemies of the empire. They claimed more men than the wars did, widening the gap between the genders further. So many men became just a name on a list, a memory for a woman waiting across the sea. The surplus was built on these lonely graves. She waited for news that often never came. The silence of the empire was the sound of her life, a long, quiet wait for a future denied. Communication took months. By the time a letter arrived, the man who wrote it might already be gone, leaving the recipient in a state of permanent limbo. On the streets of London, the visual imbalance was striking. The sheer number of women, especially in the middle and upper classes, was impossible to ignore or hide. The flirtations and the social games continued, but the stakes were higher. Every ball was a battlefield where the prize was a dwindling supply of eligible men. Behind these walls lived the surplus. They were daughters who would never leave home, sisters who would always be the second priority in their own family's house. The domestic routine was a way to fill the time, polishing, cleaning, and maintaining the appearance of a perfect home, even when the heart of it was empty. Music was an accomplishment, a skill to attract a husband. But for the surplus woman, it became a solitary outlet for the emotions she wasn't allowed to speak. Reading was their escape. They lived vicariously through the heroines of novels, dreaming of lives that the censor said they would never be able to actually have. They were the shadows of the empire. While Britain expanded its reach across the globe, these women were shrinking within the narrow confines of their own social sphere. Each birthday was a reminder of their status. After 25, a woman was considered on the shelf. After 30, she was a spinster, a label of shame. The nursery was a place they would only ever visit as aunts. They cared for the children of others, pouring their love into lives that weren't their own. They were the auxiliary mothers. They were the ones who stayed up with the sick children, the ones who taught the lessons, the ones who were always there. But who was there for them? The surplus woman lived a life of service, but who served her needs? Who acknowledged her existence beyond her utility to the family? At night, the reality set in. The cold rooms and the silent houses were a testament to the life they were forced to lead by a cruel demographic. The numbers didn't lie. The surplus was a structural reality of the Victorian age, a byproduct of the very empire that claimed to be the peak of civilization. They were categorized and filed away. Their lives were reduced to data points in a ledger, ignored by a government that didn't know how to address the issue. The church offered solace, but it also reinforced their status. They were told to be patient, to be humble, and to find joy in their silent suffering today. They prayed for a change that seemed impossible. They were the victims of a math problem that no amount of prayer or social grace could ever truly solve. Step into the drawing room. This was the glass cage of the Victorian lady. Every object here was a sign of status, and every rule was a boundary. The angel in the house was the ideal, a woman who was pure, selfless, and entirely devoted to the domestic sphere, never venturing beyond its gilded, rigid walls. For the surplus woman, this ideal was a cruel joke. How could you be the angel of a house that wasn't yours? How could you fulfill the role? They were expected to be as silent and decorative as the ornaments on the mantelpiece. Any sign of independent thought or ambition was seen as a social defect. The press mocked them. They were called redundant, useless, and unnatural. The social pressure to marry was so intense that being single was treated like a disease. The stereotype of the bitter spinster was a tool of social control. It warned young girls that if they didn't marry, this was the pathetic future awaiting. Economic pressure was the real weight. A woman of the middle class could not work for a living without losing her social standing and shaming her family. If you didn't have a husband to provide for you, and your father was gone, you were in a terrifying paradox. Too noble to work, too poor. You became the poor relation. You lived in the attic of your brother's house, wearing his wife's old clothes and serving as an unpaid housekeeper for life. This was the reality for many. They were the hidden workers of the family, the ones who did the chores that the servants wouldn't touch for free. The sound of the clock was the rhythm of their lives, ticking away the hours of a life that felt increasingly pointless in a world that didn't. The music they played was often melancholy. The cello's low cry matched the unspoken sorrow of a woman who knew she was considered a social surplus item. Who was she? Without the titles of wife or mother, the Victorian woman had no identity. She was a blank space in the ledger of her family. They were the menders. They fixed the broken things. They smoothed the ruffled feathers. They kept the peace while their own lives were falling apart in silence. The pressure to conform was suffocating. To be a surplus woman was to live in a state of constant apology for your very existence in the world. Every social interaction was a reminder of their status. They were the ones who sat at the end of the table, the ones who were spoken over. Their movements were controlled. They had to be invisible to move through the house without disturbing the delicate balance of the family that was hosting them today. They kept things, old letters, dried flowers, and small mementos of a time when they might have been chosen. These were the only treasures they truly possessed. In the pages of a book, they could be anyone. They could be the hero, the explorer, the one who is loved. But the morning always returned. The light was always limited. They had to be careful with every resource, for they had nothing of their own. They lived on the charity of others. This was the end of the road. A simple stone, often without a mention of their life beyond their relationship to a man, forgotten in death as well. The doors were closed to them. The door to education, the door to work, and the door to a life of their own choosing were all locked. They were the other mothers. They raised the children of the empire, teaching them the values they themselves were being crushed by every single day of life. Education was a tool they used to help others, yet they were often denied it themselves. They were the teachers who were never allowed to become scholars. They had the intellect of explorers but were confined to the parlour. Their minds were vast while their worlds were narrow and filled with domestic trivia today. The physical toll was real. The constant labour of the poor relation aged them prematurely, turning them into the old aunts before they were even 40. They were the ghosts in the machine of the Victorian family. Essential yet ignored, present yet invisible, they were the surplus that held the house together. They were the caged birds of the era. They had songs to sing, but the world didn't want to hear them. They were meant to be seen. Even in nature they were restricted. They had to walk on the paths to remain decorous, to never run or show the passion that burned inside. Their lives were often cut short by neglect or the sheer exhaustion of their service. They were the expendable members of the middle-class family structure tonight. Even their queen was a symbol of the very norms that imprisoned them. Victoria was the ultimate wife and mother, an impossible standard for the surplus. They lived in a state of permanent mourning for the lives they didn't lead, the children they didn't have, and the independence they were never allowed to claim. Where could they go? The surplus woman was a traveller without a destination, a person without a purpose in a world that demanded a very specific role. They held the keys to their own prisons. They were taught to police themselves, to be their own wardens in the cage of Victorian social and moral. They were fading away. The surplus woman was a disappearing act, a person who became less real with every passing year of her silent and lonely. Sometimes the pressure was too much, the silence would break, but the world would only see it as a nervous collapse or a sign of female. They were the unseen, the women who were always in the room but never truly heard. They were the surplus that society chose to ignore completely. Their tears were private. They were the silent sorrow of a generation of women who were told they were unnecessary, redundant, and surplus to the world. For many surplus women, the only respectable way out was to become a governess. But this was not a dream. It was a life of liminality. You were not family, yet you were not a servant. You lived in the cracks of the household, a ghost who taught the children of the isolation was profound. You were too educated for the servants' hall, but too poor for the dining room. You were a woman without a home. Your job was to pass on the very values that had trapped you. You taught the girls to be decorative and the boys to be their masters. It was a life of constant discipline for the children, but mostly for yourself. You had to be the perfect model of decorum at every waking moment. If not a governess, then a seamstress. For those of lower social standing, the needle was their only friend and their most cruel and constant master. These were the sweatshops of the 19th century. Women worked 18-hour days, their eyesight fading and their fingers bleeding just to earn enough to survive. The pay was a pittance. Many seamstresses lived on the brink of starvation, their surplus status making them easily replaceable in a market that didn't care. The step from seamstress to the street was tragically short. Many women left without support were forced into the only work that was always available for them. This was the dark side of the Victorian surplus. When society offers no work and no husband, it leaves a woman with no choices but thee. But some women fought back. Florence Nightingale chose a path that was considered degrading for a lady, turning nursing into a respected and vital scientific profession. She proved that a woman's value was not tied to her marital status, but to her skills, her intelligence, and her ability to save human lives. Others took to the pen. Writing under male pseudonyms, surplus women like the Brontes and George Eliot explored the internal lives of women with shocking honesty. They had to hide their identity to be heard, and their surplus time became the fuel for some of the greatest literature in the entire English language. These women were no longer surplus. They were essential voices of their age. They were redefining what it meant to be a woman, one page at. Every ink stain was a mark of defiance. They were reclaiming their intellect from a world that told them they only had a heart for marriage. Slowly, the professions began to open. Medicine, education, and social work became the new battlegrounds where the surplus women fought for their right to exist. They were the first female doctors, the first lecturers, the first inspectors. They used their extra years to build careers that changed the world forever. They began to organise. If society wouldn't give them a place, they would build one themselves. They founded schools, hospitals, and refuges for other women. They were the pioneers of social reform. The surplus women who had nothing to lose became the most fearless advocates for the poor and the marginalised. Knowledge was their weapon. They read, they studied, and they challenged the scientific theories that claimed women were biologically inferior and only fit for the home. They were finding their voice. In the quiet corners of the empire, the surplus women were talking to each other, and the conversation was becoming revolutionary. Their horizons were expanding. They realised that the world was much larger than the parlour, and they were determined to see every single part of it. The surplus was becoming a strength. With no husband to obey and no children to raise, they had the most dangerous thing of all: time. They began to travel, not as wives of officers, but as explorers in their own right. They went to Africa, to Asia, and to the Americas. They documented everything. Their journals are a testament to the curiosity and the bravery of the women that Victorian society had tried to hide and forget. Under the stars of a different continent, they found a sense of belonging that they had never felt in the drawing rooms of London or Bristol. They were no longer defined by what they lacked. They were defined by what they did, what they saw, and what they had finally learned about. This was the liberation of the surplus. When you are told you are nothing, you are free to become anything. They took that freedom and ran. The sensible boots were no longer just for the hallway. They were for the trail, the laboratory, and the streets of a world they were reclaiming. They were the mothers of modern science. Their work in chemistry, botany, and mathematics laid the groundwork for the discoveries of the next century and beyond. They were the collectors of the world. Their specimens filled the museums, and their papers filled the journals, even if their names were often omitted later. They were the educators of a new generation. They taught the next wave of women that they were not a surplus, but a vital and necessary. The cycle of silence was being broken. The surplus women were passing on the tools of liberation to the girls who would become the suffragettes and thinkers. She was no longer the poor relation in the attic. She was a woman of substance, a woman of history, a woman who had survived, and the darkness was retreating. The light of their intelligence and their work was finally beginning to be seen by the society that had tried to extinguish. The city was hers now. She was no longer a shadow, but a visible and active participant in the life of the nation she lived in today. The story was changing. The surplus women were no longer the victims of the narrative. They were the authors of a new and exciting future for. They were the pioneers of the single life. They proved that a woman could be whole, happy, and successful without a husband by her side, and the surplus was a myth. There was no such thing as an extra human being. There were only people whose potential had been cruelly and unfairly. As the century drew to a close, the surplus women were at the forefront of the change. They were the ones who had paved the way. They were the bridge between the old world and the new. They were the ones who had dared to be surplus, and in doing so freed. The doors were finally opening. The work they had done in the shadows was coming into the light, and the world would never be the same. They were the ancestors of independence. Every modern woman who chooses her own path owes a debt to the surplus women of the 19th century today. The dawn of a new century was coming, and the surplus women were ready to step into it, no longer as extras, but as the main. By the late 19th century, the surplus was no longer a weight, but an engine of change. Education became the first great wall to crumble down. Colleges for women were founded, often by those who'd been told their minds were only fit for domestic trifles. They thirsted for real hard knowledge. They studied medicine, law, and history. They were no longer spinsters, they were scholars. The label was being replaced by a much more powerful and meaningful. Each degree was a victory over the census. They were proving that a woman's value was inherent, not something granted by a husband at the altar. They were the first to enter the professional workforce in significant numbers. Their surplus time allowed them to dedicate themselves fully to their chosen fields. They were astronomers, chemists, and botanists. They were uncovering the secrets of the universe, while the world was still trying to decide if they should. They founded their own journals. They had something to say, and they were no longer waiting for a man's permission to say it to the world. The surplus of numbers was becoming a surplus of political power. When you have no husband to obey, you have the freedom to demand your rights. They formed communities. In the surplus years, they found a different kind of love, the love of sisterhood and the shared purpose of making a world. They were not alone. They were a movement. The surplus women were the backbone of the early feminist movement, fighting for the rights of all women. They were the suffragettes. They were the ones who chained themselves to railings and went on hunger strikes. They had nothing left to fear from society. They were willing to pay the price. They were already marginalised, already surplus. Prison was just another room where their spirit could not be held down. The angel in the house was dead. In her place was a woman who was angry, active, and determined to change the world by any means. They wore their colours with pride. They were no longer hiding in the shadows. They were the most visible and vocal force in the entire nation. They were the journalists who reported on the struggle. They were shaping the public narrative, turning the surplus into a symbol of progress and. The world was listening. The census of 1851 was a distant memory, replaced by the roar of a generation of women who were claiming their. The fashion was changing too. The corset was being cast aside for clothes that allowed for movement work and the life of an active and. They were literally and figuratively breaking free. The physical constraints were gone, and the psychological ones were following close behind in the wake of the change. The bicycle was a machine of freedom. It allowed women to travel without a chaperone, to see the world and to feel the wind on there. Everything was moving faster now. The surplus women were the ones leading the race toward a new century and a new way of being, and the vote was the ultimate goal. It was the recognition of their status as full citizens, not just surplus members of a male-dominated and. That single piece of paper represented a century of struggle. It was the answer to the census of 1851 and the final word on the. They had won not just the vote, but the right to be themselves. The surplus was gone, replaced by a generation of women who were and. She remembered the parlour and the attic. She remembered the silence and the shame. And now she saw the world she had helped to and. The day was ending, but a new one was beginning. The surplus women had finished their work and they were leaving a legacy that would, and we must remember them, not as victims, but as pioneers. They were the ones who dared to be more than what they were told they were. Their stories are here, in the books they wrote and the laws they changed. They are the silent heroes of the Victorian age and. We light a candle for them tonight. For the aunts, the sisters and the governesses who lived in the shadows so that we could live in. They were the keepers of the flame. They kept the intellect and the spirit of women alive during a long and. They are us. Their struggle is our history, and their victory is our freedom. The surplus women were never extra, they were and. They are the light of the past, and they will always be a part of the future we are building together, one step at a. The story is over, but the memory remains. The surplus women of the Victorian age will never be forgotten again in the and. She is free, and in her freedom she is a testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome even the most and. The flower has bloomed. The pressed flower of the past has been replaced by the living flower of the present and. She has broken through the wall. She is no longer in the cage. She is in the world, and the world is her own, and she sees the future. And it is a future where no woman is ever called surplus again, in any census, or any and. She is at peace. The struggle is behind her, and the road ahead is her own to choose, and to and. She is grounded. She is rooted in her own strength and her own history, and she will never be moved again by the and. The sky is the limit, and she is ready to fly. The surplus women have found their wings, and they are an and. The bird is free, the cage is empty, and the world is full of song. The story of the surplus women is a and. Goodbye to the shadows, goodbye to the silence, goodbye to the surplus. A new day is here, and it is an and. She is happy, and she is whole. And she is finally, truly, and completely seen for the and. The window is open, the air is clear, and the world is waiting for her to step into it, and. She is ready. The surplus women of the past have given her the strength to face the future with and. She is the legacy, she is the proof. She is the woman who was never surplus, and she never will be again today. As we look back at the surplus women, we don't see failures. We see the pioneers who paved the way for every modern, independent woman today. Their struggle was the foundation of our freedom. The extra time they had was spent building the intellectual and social structures that we now inhabit. They were the first to prove that marriage was not the only source of a woman's identity or worth. They lived it, often at great. Today, being a single woman is a choice, not a social death sentence. We owe that shift in perspective to the women who were labelled. The surplus was a strength they didn't know they had until they were forced to use it. They turned a social problem into a revolution. They were the writers who didn't need a husband's name to be heard. They were the thinkers who didn't need a parlour to have a. They were the explorers who didn't need a chaperone to see the world. They were the women who dared to be surplus and found themselves. They redefined value. They showed that a human life is not a math problem, and no person can ever be truly redundant or extra today. We are their daughters in spirit. We are the ones who carry their torch into the future, making sure that their names are finally heard. Their legacy is all around us. In every classroom, every hospital, and every boardroom, the presence of independent women is a testament to their victory. We honour them by living our lives fully. We honour them by refusing to be limited by the expectations of others, just as they did. We are the authors of our own stories now. The surplus women were the ones who taught us how to pick up the pen and write. Thank you for walking through history with me tonight. Their story is a reminder that even in the darkest shadows, a light can be found. The night is over, the dawn has come, and as the world wakes up, we carry the memory of those forgotten women into the light. May their resilience inspire you, and may their courage give you strength. You're never extra, you're always enough in this vast world. As you move into your day, remember the surplus women. Remember that their surplus was actually the beginning of our most precious and freedom. Every life is a world in itself. No census can capture the depth of a person's spirit, or the impact of their silent and work. They are no longer surplus. They are our ancestors, our teachers, and our friends. They are finally, truly, and. Sleep well tonight, knowing that the past is a part of you, and the future is yours to create, one beautiful day at a time. The locket is no longer a symbol of loss, but of connection. We are linked to those women by a thread of and strength. Time moves on, but some things remain. The courage of the surplus women is one of those things that will never and again. Listen to the song of the world. It is a song of freedom, a song of hope, and a song of the women who fought. The surplus is gone. The woman is here, and she is magnificent. Her story is our story, and it is a story of and. She is going where she belongs, into a world of her own making, a world where she is and. The flower is blooming, the past is forgiven, and the future is wide open for every woman who dares to be and. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. The surplus women are finally home in the heart of history, where they always and. The journey is complete. We have seen the truth behind the label, and we have found the beauty in the surplus of their and. Good night. May your dreams be filled with the stories of the brave, and may you always know that you are an and. The star is a reminder. Even in the vastness of the universe, every life matters, and every story is worth telling to the and. The end of the story, the beginning of your own. Sleep peacefully and remember the women who live so that we could be and.